Welcome to this edition of Journals of Spiritual Discovery, brought to you by spiritualteachers.org. I'm your host, Sean Nevins. Hello and welcome. I have just a couple of quick notes before we get into this episode. The first item I want to mention is that August 16th through the 18th, the TAT Foundation is having a gathering that is near Chapel Hill, Durham, Raleigh, North Carolina, the Triangle area. Certainly hope that you can make that. The theme is called Running Between the Raindrops. You might ask yourself what in the world that is about, so I just wanted to give a quick quote. It references a phrase that Richard Rose used to use, and I thought this quote gave a feel for it. He said, "But there is another method, another way of life. Its description is also paradoxical. Perhaps the only solution to a paradox is another paradox. The human spiritual quest must become a vector, with all of that human's energy behind that vector. And the shortest distance between aim and objective is supposed to be a straight line. But success in a spiritual venture requires the ability to run between the raindrops, which may appear to be a zigzag course, which may include dynamic feints and matched states of high indifference." So if that quote makes you curious, I hope you can make it to this event. Go to tatfoundation.org. On the events page, you can find more information. It's coming up soon, August 16th through the 18th. I'll be there. I'll be doing workshop sessions, so hope to see you there. One other item I want to mention is that we're having a sale on t-shirts through Friday, July 26th. So deadline's even shorter on that, but you can get 20% off the t-shirts, notebooks, and other items at the spiritualteachers.org store. You may wonder, do I make thousands, tens, or hundreds of thousands of dollars off the store? No, I don't, but perhaps someday I will. Regardless, sale going on right now. Go to spiritualteachers.org. There's a button there that says store. If you click that, it will take you to books, films, and t-shirts. Books and films are not on sale, but the t-shirts are. So 20% off. Got several interesting designs, all or most of which friends have helped me with. So it's a nice collaborative effort. Certainly appreciate all the help I've had with those designs. Check them out. They're kind of cool. Once again, spiritualteachers.org. Go to the store. That's it. I hope you enjoy this episode. All right, welcome to this edition of Journals of Spiritual Discovery. I am here with Filo Sophie King, who is the author of the new book, Imaginary Conversations with Imaginary People, Awakening to the Unspeakable Through Enlightened Dialogue. Welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Sean. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. We are actually by the Bear River at the moment. Philo is a friend of mine who joins me in gold panning expeditions now and then. So we share that love as well as a love of whatever you want to call it. The spiritual search, awakening, enlightenment, non-duality, all that. And that's why we're here today, not to talk about gold panning, but to talk about this new book, Awakening to the Unspeakable Through Enlightened Dialogue, Imaginary Conversations with Imaginary People. Philo, I wanted to start sort of at the end of the book. There's a statement that you make at the end of the book that I thought was just absolutely remarkable to see. And it says, I believe on the very last page, "My commitment is such that I offer anyone who purchases and reads this book ongoing personal pointers free of charge for the remainder of my lifetime. I cannot guarantee the falling away of that which obscures you. That is up to your destiny, the will of the Absolute. But I promise to be by your side every step of the way for as long as I am alive. I was really, really struck by that, and I'm just, where did the inspiration for that come from?
It came from just understanding that what I am trying to share in the book is everybody belongs to everybody. So why should they have to pay for it? And there's a tradition of this in spiritual teachings where, for instance, the Buddha, Jesus Christ, all of these amazing people spoke these words to their disciples and to the multitude, so to speak, and they never charged any money for that. In fact, they even spent their own money or used their own efforts to accommodate everybody. So I just felt it was just very natural to pass that on. Yeah, I just want everyone to know that this is what they are, and it's already inherent, and so it belongs to you. And I'm just going to be here to help you see that if I can, if that's how it shakes out.
I'm certainly curious. How long has your book been out now? Is it a few months?
About 4.5 months. It came out at the 27th December, 2023.
Okay.
And it's been out since then.
Have you had anyone take you up on your offer yet? Have people reached out to you?
Not directly, but I've been doing some interviews and some things on YouTube, and people are coming through that way, asking questions or commenting on what I'm saying. And so it's kind of working out that way. But no one has contacted me directly yet.
Yeah, I was curious about that because I could imagine it being maybe a little bit intimidating that, I can read this book, yeah, but now someone's actually offering to help me, which might mean more effort or more work or be confrontational in some way.
Yes, it's definitely a two-way street. I wasn't expecting a flood of emails or phone calls from this, but the offer is out there for anyone to take up on if they so desire. I think if I'd have seen something like that, if I had read the book and enjoyed the book, I would have taken advantage of that too.
Did you come across in your path any teachers who exemplified that idea?
Not directly. In fact, the person that was my, in quotes, teacher for many years, he did charge money. It was kind of like presented as a kind of a tithe / donation. That's how it was presented. But basically it was a payment, a monthly payment. So I don't have any issues with that. It's just that it's not how I want to do things.
Yeah. And your teacher, which I know you and I have talked a little bit about that in the past, is this the teacher who was connected to the Fourth Way teachings?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
And so the Fourth Way is a fairly significant body of work for you?
It was at the time. When I first came across the Fourth Way, it was about 30 years ago. And some of the ideas in that book really resonated with me. And it was actually said in one of the books by Uspensky that there weren't any more schools, that schools were a thing of the past. So I was quite surprised to find that there was actually a school. So it just seemed for me very natural to join this school and get more involved in the Fourth Way and begin trying to find out who the mystery is at the core of Philo. But the fourth way, I have to say, doesn't take you all the way.
That's something that I've definitely wondered about over the years. As I recall, they talk about the what is it? Is it the fourth way man or the fourth level of man? I forget the language. Man number 1, man number 2, etc.
Yes.
And it went all the way up to man number
7. Yes.
But it was always very unclear what man number 7 really was, what that meant in the teachings.
Right. They didn't describe it or try to describe it. One of the things about the fourth way is that it assumes that you are at the level of 1, 2, or 3. And if you're lucky, you might get to 4, possibly 5, and then it stops there. So as soon as you feel like you've moved beyond that, there's no path. It's like a landscape with no map. And I'm not sure if that was intentional or not. But that's the case. And it seems like very few, if any, people directly working with Uspensky or Gurdjieff actually awakened. It actually seems like none of them did. So there's all kinds of reasons for that we can talk about. But at the time, I had no idea. I just knew that I was a man number 3, because that's the emotional man. And I could get to a man number 4, which is someone that's established in the work of being present and knows what that is and can do it. And then hopefully because my goal was always to awaken, not even knowing what that really even meant. But I knew that was the goal. And so 5, 6, and 7 were just kind of like destinations to be achieved.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I did want to ask you, when you first got into the fourth way teachings, that was your goal, or that was what you were after? I want to awaken. And
yes.
And if so, where did that come from?
Yes. I remember before finding the school, but knowing about the fourth way books, because a friend of mine had actually found one of the books. And I remember we were driving somewhere in London, and he suddenly just said, do you know why the world's the way it is? Why there's so much conflict and suffering and people doing bad things and stuff? And I said, no, why? I said, it's just human nature. He said, it's because everyone's asleep. And when he said that, I had this moment of what they would call the third state. It means that you're present and you're aware of your presence. And it triggered that for me, that moment of presence. So I immediately wanted to know more about that. And he said that there are people that have awakened, and they're the opposite of the world. They're kind of like, they see the world for what it is. And they are compassionate, they are loving, they're peaceful, they're at peace with themselves and with the world. And that's the awakened state. And I said, oh, I'd love to have that perspective, rather than this one of dealing with conflict and navigating conflict. And so, it kind of came from there. But of course, it means so much more than that, as we know now. But at the time, it was a very simple goal: how to move away from suffering and become at peace. It wasn't that I was not at peace. I've had many peaceful moments over my lifetime, so I knew what it was, but it was always conditioned on what other people did or what things were happening. And it didn't seem to be real inner peace. At that time, it seemed to me it was all driven from outside. So the fourth way kind of hinted at a process whereby the peace was with you, and no matter what happened out there, it wouldn't affect the peace that's innate to you. So That's what took me on that path.
And in your book, you mentioned self-remembering several times as a practice or a technique. My memory many years ago reading Uspensky's work of what self-remembering was, I think is probably wrong. I would be very curious to hear an explanation from you of what is self-remembering.
Right. Self-remembering, it has other terms that were actually more useful for me. One of them being being present. And the other one was this idea of mindfulness that comes from Buddhism. So self-remembering is kind of that. But in the Gurdjieffian method and in the way that he taught it, the self had to remember itself. And that was kind of misleading because I started out and for a long time thought that this personal self, Philo here, had to remember himself. And so whenever I was present, and a thought would come up and say, oh, I'm present now, I'm remembering myself. And that's the cul-de-sac that one finds oneself in, that the belief in a personal self here remembering itself. So it's already divided, split into two. And now I understand it, that the self that's being remembered, it's not really being remembered, is the one self. You could say it's the one self, or I call it being. And it's not really being remembered. It's more like all of the thoughts, all of the mini-me's, the I-I's, they fall away. And it happens every day with everyone at a certain point. The tension drops away and there's just a moment of peace and no thoughts about the self. And that's it. That's the self-remembering. But that self is universal and impersonal. It's not a personal self. The personal self is the ego. So what I was doing was, for many years, was as an ego trying to awaken. And that's kind of impossible. I don't know if that answered your question. But...
No, well, I'm curious from both the perspective of Uspensky and Gurdjieff in their books, as well as your teacher, who was in the Fourth Way tradition.
Yeah.
Is what they meant by self-remembering different than what you now understand to be self-remembering?
So, because we weren't there with them, we don't know for sure. And the way it was interpreted by this teacher was a personal self. And that's kind of the experience. Like, we experience this personal self. I'm Philo, you're Sean. You drive, I bicycle. There's this personal self doing things. And, but it seems to me in the awakening, it's understood that that the personal self is just a kind of a construction placed there by our upbringings and society and school and education and all of that. And it's a way for us to be able to navigate the physical phenomenal world and be in the world and do all the things necessary in the world. But in terms of the spiritual search, that is actually one of the obstacles. And so in the awakening, it's understood that the self that was trying to remember was the self that could never remember. It was just a thought construction trying to awaken. And it's understood that the awakeness was always already there. And that's the revelation. But none of that comes through in the Fourth Way books. They didn't get that far with it. They just assumed people were just going to learn how to be present. And it seems like they were not thinking of anyone going any further than that. So then one has to move out of the tradition of the fourth way into other traditions, which is what I had to do. Speaking to you was actually instrumental in all of that. In a way, you just gave me another perspective that I hadn't really considered. And then reading some of the non-duality books, particularly Ramana Maharshi. I don't really think he's non-duality as such. He never mentions that, but he's talking about looking inwards into what one is and seeing that one isn't the thoughts and isn't the feeling of a self, and seeing that there's still something there, and that is what he calls the one self. So from when he said that's the only self, that suddenly made sense, that was the self-remembering that should have taken place 30 years previously. And so then it all made sense, and then I was able to have a breakthrough with that. Having said all that, the fourth way has a lot of information and a lot of psychological information that's very useful for understanding the Philo person and other people. So it's useful for that. But it took Ramana Maharshi and you and certain other books to get me through that final gateless gate, so to speak.
In regards to the about 30 years that you spent with this teacher, would you say that was it towards the end of that time that you felt like you were in this cul-de-sac? I guess my question would be, you must have been getting benefit and feeling like you were getting somewhere with these teachings, making some progress, or you wouldn't have spent that long of a time in it. Did a point come where you felt like, I just got to try something new?
Yes, some things happened, and some of them happened way back, as way far back as 2007, when I realized I was no longer on the map. I was no longer on the map. I was out there in the wild without a map, and there was no one that could tell me what was going on at that time. Teacher certainly couldn't. And it was around then when I began to think, there's something's not right here. There's no map for this. There's no teaching for this, for what's happening here. And so I would seemingly move between being this awareness and then being Philo again, and then being this awareness. And this was happening, being the awareness was happening for longer and longer durations. So I still felt that Philo was somehow doing this. But there was some, so I felt like there was some progress, but it was blind. Like Philo was just walking around in circles, having these experiences, not having any real explanations, and just assuming, oh, that's Philo doing, that's Philo making progress. So that's when I began to feel like something was off with the teaching, because everyone else just seemed to be treading water, so to speak. They were being present and not knowing what that was, not inquiring into the presence. And so they just bobbed around, and some of them for even longer than me, 50 years, doing this, without really any further direction. But there was a reluctance to move away from, because it's not just a teaching and a teacher, it's also a community and friends and family. So it was difficult to move away from that and from them, because you were moving away from your social structure and everybody that you knew and everything that you knew. And so that kind of made the process longer, if you like. It took me from 2007. Something again happened around 2017. There's another big awakening that had no explanation or any. I couldn't read about it. I couldn't talk to anyone about it. And then that was 2017. And at that point, I began to then start talking to people outside of the fourth way and looking around. And I saw the TAT website, and I looked on it, and I saw your name as someone living in San Francisco. And so I thought, oh, maybe I could contact this person. And it still took me a while to do that, but eventually I did. So all of that time I did benefit from the social structure and the way that that teaching was set up. It was set up to be present to beautiful things. So going to art galleries, listening to beautiful music, dining with beautiful, plates and flatware. Everything was based around beauty and around the arts. So that kind of keeps you engaged for a while. But it's also a distraction from the actual spiritual search. Now you're just swapping one environment for another one. Yes, it's more beautiful and there's presence there, but it's not the awakening. So it still has the shortcomings. So finally I had to let go of all of that in order to talk to other people and discover a deeper path in, which is what the self-inquiry process is. I think that's the thing that's missing from the fourth way, is actually taking self-remembering and using that to inquire. That concentrated attention, using it to inquire inwards into what is actually present here. And then you can discover and make those final steps. But if your awareness is always out there, being present to that tree, then you're not looking in. And so you don't make the discoveries that need to be made.
That reminds me of a quote about self-remembering from your book. Let's see, you said, I applied it, meaning self-remembering, by building my life around it. If my eyes were open, I was self-remembering or trying to self-remember or thinking about self-remembering or reading about it, sometimes even dreaming about it. Self-remembering really has to become your life. Only then can you attempt to go beyond it. Self-remembering by some means or other has to become self-realization. When I read that, I feel a certain intensity or dedication to it, and but I think sometimes when I talk with you, you have a very easygoing way about you, and I wonder, well, is Philo really this intense guy on the inside, and he just has kind of a personality that he puts on show for the world of being easygoing? So which is it?
Well, it's both. But what I'm really talking about there is the intensity of the spiritual ego. It's like when we were talking earlier of burning that stick, using the stick to move the embers around, and so the fire eventually burns out, and so does the stick. Well, that's what was happening there for Philo, is that all of these efforts were coming from an ego, a spiritual ego, trying to awaken. And that spiritual ego, at least for me, had to burn out. And in the burning out of the spiritual ego, the realization can happen. So the self-remembering is really the spiritual ego's practice. For me, it took that long to realize that the practice was going nowhere. In fact, it was designed to go nowhere in a way. It's designed, in a way, spiritual practices are designed to burn out the spiritual ego. It's the only way that it will die. It won't die by itself. It won't intentionally kill itself. It will always be trying to become the thing. And so it's very, very clever in a way if it was designed that way. But teachings burn out the ego if they're doing their job. And then something that can, as soon as that ego falls away, the truth is seen. And then you suddenly realize the ego was the final veil. The spiritual ego is the final veil in a way. And as soon as that burns out, then the truth can be seen. And then the self-remembering does become self-realization. But it's not the ego self. The self-realization is the one self, the non-dual awareness that we all are. I'm probably a bit more easygoing now than I was back then.
I mean, it's I certainly have a belief that passion for the search, intensity for the search is of great value because it means that it's something that you are truly want to know about. You've connected with a desire in yourself.
Yes, for sure. It is very, very, I feel like it's very important. So sometimes these days, people try to bypass all of that. They take the non-dual teaching and they say, I'm already that. And you have to wonder, are they really already that, or are they just saying that? And without making any judgments about it. But for me, the journey was to burn out, was to be that passionate and to see that that wasn't going to do it. And to suddenly there's this kind of relaxation, kind of like a death. In a way, it is like, I experienced it as death actually. There was a when the Philo spiritual ego burned out, there was a disappearance of Philo and Philo's world and the whole world. Everything was gone. There was nothing there except there was something there. And I was describing it to someone the other day. I described it like the fire goes out and there's a little curl of smoke, the final curl of smoke, and then that disappears. And in that final curl of smoke, something is seen. The ego, the spiritual ego, sees the futility of everything, and that what's really there, what it's been searching for, was always already there. And it's able to let go in that moment and just be that smoke disappearing. And then it comes back. It's not like you die and you're dead. You come back, but now this understanding is in place. And so the ego can no longer fool you. It can no longer say, oh, that's me being present. It just can't do that anymore. So it just plays its normal role of being a person in the world. And I happen to be very fortunate that I work with young people at risk. And the spiritual ego is very suited to that kind of job, because it is naturally peaceful and wants to be helpful and wants to help in any way that it can. So the spiritual ego finds a place for itself in the world and continues, but it doesn't have this wrong picture anymore. The wrong picture has been destroyed. And then the beingness directs everything. For me, the beingness is doing everything, and we're just the vessels or the instruments for that doing. So I don't ascribe anything to Philo.
You wrote, I've never really meditated. For a long time, my primary practice was self-remembering, being present, which I think is a form of self-inquiry, in that it is the state that self-inquiry throws you into. I have found that I no longer need to practice this. Being present has become as effortless and natural as breathing. So is self-remembering the same thing as self-inquiry?
It starts you off in the same place. Like, you can't do self-inquiry without being present. So as soon as you say, who am I, that evokes presence somehow. Somehow the ego falls away in that question. And there's presence. And so self-remembering does the same thing it's kind of counterintuitive, but when you suddenly understand that you're aware of the tree and also you're aware of Philo here, somewhere in between that there's presence. And so that's what I would call self-remembering. That suddenly the thought goes, or the attention divides itself between the person here and whatever is being seen out there. And in that space is presence. And self-inquiry does the same thing. But self-inquiry has a deeper intent, because now we take that presence and we use it. The presence is kind of like a focused attention, or it can be that way. The attention can be focused in presence, and then it can be used to turn inwards and to look in, to see, well, is there a Philo here? Who is this person here? And you can then see that actually there is no one there. There's no person there. Philo's an idea that commandeers the body, seems to direct the body, or it makes those attributions to itself. It says, I'm walking, I'm running. In fact, Philo's just commentating on what's happening and attributing. So that's seen through with self-inquiry. One sees that. One sees that Philo is just this voice that attributes whatever is happening to itself. And then one keeps looking, and then it just becomes self-evident that what's looking is awareness looking at itself. It's all awareness. And then that can open into understanding that the world itself is the same awareness. That everything is just awareness. And so we have this idea that all of these years we were looking out of our eyes into the world, and really what was happening was awareness was looking inwards at itself. That's kind of how I see it now. So awareness just looking inwards and seeing the world, and it not being separate from the world. But the world depends on awareness. Like the world can disappear as it does, like at night, the dreamless sleep stage. The world disappears, but awareness is still there. So awareness isn't dependent on the world. It transcends whatever it's looking at. It somehow has a transcendent aspect to it, and in that sense, it's unconditioned. It's not conditioned by. It's not dependent on phenomena. So that all of these things that you read about suddenly begin to make sense once you've inquired and come to that understanding. Then you see, oh yes, everything depends on this, on awareness. Awareness is unconditioned. All of this is conditioned. And it's not that it's a separate thing. It's not that it's different. It's the same, but it's just conditioned. It's almost like the awareness is the unconditioned source of all conditions. I'm using a lot of words here, but I hope I'm conveying something. It's your fault, Sean.
Well, I'm asking questions, and that does tend to generate words.
Yeah, they're great questions.
Although we could go into silence.
Yes.
I don't know how useful that will be for the interview.
Well, it should be known that the silence is also for me, very important. It was a way when I started to, after talking to you and delving more deeply into Ramana Maharshi's work and beginning to explore the self-inquiry, what happened quite naturally was that the thoughts just fell away. There were just periods of time with no thought, and there was just the pure discernment. And that's, I think, is what the silence and the no thought is very useful for, is that it can be discerned more clearly what awareness is and what your being is, because the thoughts are not distracting you. And it's mostly the thoughts that do the distraction, it seems to me. So the silence for me was important. The clarity that brought into the looking seemed to be very helpful. Now it's moot. It can be silent or it can be noisy. It doesn't matter. Now that it's been seen, things can go back to normal. It's all moot. It's all the same thing. But until it's been seen, it's very confusing as to what's present, what am I, what is awareness. All of these questions still bug you. So you have to really see that clearly, and the silence can help.
So for those people who it's rare to have any silence in their mind, or maybe have never had silence in their mind, do you have any recommendations about what might be helpful?
Yes, I would say that that's probably a belief, that you don't have any silence in the mind. Because I think the natural state of things is actually silence. It's silence in which the thoughts arise into. We just don't notice it because maybe there are so many thoughts. But in between the thoughts, when the thought goes, there's silence there. Maybe another thought will arise, in the next microsecond. So one has to reorient oneself and just take the position that the silence is already there. It's the background to the noise. And then just sit and wait and just relax. That's the other thing. Relax. Like, take a nap and wake up and just be quiet for a while. Because that's seems to be a nice time, a helpful time. That time in the morning or just before you go to sleep, when the thoughts are naturally dying down, is another time to explore and not meditate, but trying to see the silence. It's there. It's the background. It's just so easily overlooked and distracted. We are so easily distracted with thoughts, actions, emotions, television.
I was just thinking you might start a new religious movement if you're going to advocate that napping is an important spiritual practice.
Oh, it's so important.
You could come up with a napping system.
Yeah.
A certain number of naps one must do every day.
Yeah, do something really strenuous in the morning. And, in many parts of the world, the nap is actually a part of the day, like in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
Places like that. And those places that tend to be more laid back, more relaxed places, and the people are more open. So give it a try. Just relax. Like the thoughts just disappeared.
Yeah.
That's happening all the time with people. They're just not paying attention. They're too busy driving. They don't notice when that silence happens. Because their thoughts, when the thoughts come back in, they're just so dominant.
It sounds like what you're saying is that self-remembering is a practice that can lead you to self-inquiry, but a person could also do a more direct self-inquiry. I know that the classic self-inquiry question is, who am I? Which for some people that question doesn't really mean much to them. And they ask it and there's no passion behind it, let's say. Do you have any thoughts about ways to do self-inquiry other than asking, who am I?
The best self-inquiry doesn't have the question. Like, the question is part of the practice for the spiritual ego. But the intention behind the question, I feel like, is what's doing the work. So if the words "who am I" don't evoke anything, then just don't use them. But still try to see, when you're walking down the road, who's walking down the road? And just try to see who's actually walking down the road now. Who's speaking now? Who's eating now? Is there a controller somewhere that's eating, directing everything, or is it all just happening spontaneously? And just be open to what you're doing in any moment. Like, one of the revelations for me, this was a few years ago, I was eating and I suddenly looked at my hands moving and doing all this stuff. And I thought, how can there be a person in here making all these decisions? It's too fast and too spontaneous. I don't even know what piece of the dish I'm going to eat next.
All right.
There's no one in there doing that. That's happening. So that's self-inquiry right there. Now you've understood that there's no one in here directing everything. It's all just spontaneous happenings, spontaneous intelligence happening. And then a thought is overlaying itself on that and saying, that's me, I'm eating. So just to see that in any moment, whatever activity it is you're doing. And actually, when you're doing sports, that's another great time to inquire, because often, if you're playing it at a good enough level, there's no me there. It's all just happening. You can see that. You don't have a me saying, I'm going to throw the tennis ball and I'm going to hit it at just that moment so that it goes over the net fast enough to go past the other guy. No, that all just happens in one fluid, no meanness. And so you can think about that as you're playing. Well, who's doing this? Especially, the better you are at a sport, the easier it is to see that there's no person doing it.
All right. Why is that? Why is it that when I'm struggling with something, whatever, let's use your sport analogy. Let's say I'm trying to learn how to do whatever you call it in tennis, serve. I'm trying to learn how to serve the tennis ball. Mm-hmm. I've never done it before. It's really, really hard. And I feel like I'm working really hard and I'm getting frustrated with myself. I can't do this. This is not working. I'm looking at the ball very carefully and thinking about all this thinking is going on.
Yeah.
And why is it that all of that seems to make it much more me and real?
Yes.
And it seems to be very difficult in those circumstances to feel like all of this is happening automatically. Feels like there's a lot of personal effort going on.
Yeah.
What is up with that?
Well, I think it's the way, this is where the fourth way becomes useful. They have an explanation for this. They say that when you learn new things, first everything goes through the intellectual center, which is the me, the center of the me, basically the brain, the intellect. Things go in through there, and then they pass into the moving and instinctive centers. So if you're doing sports, that's where you want it to be. You want it to be in the moving, instinctive functions. And it's like when you learn to ride a bike, it's the same thing, or when you learn to drive a car. First of all, everything's happening all at once, you're confused. That's the intellectual center. It doesn't operate at a fast enough speed. It's analyzing and comparing, and so it's slowing things down. But the moving center is operating at a much faster speed, and the instinctive center. So once the learning has got into those centers, basically the intellect can just shut down and not be involved. And the more it's shut down, the better the person is at playing, because they just don't have that second guessing analysis stuff going on. They're just in the flow. They call it the flow. They're in that zone where everything's just happening perfectly. Like a great tennis player is not thinking about what they're doing. They're just moving. They're in the moment, and they're present, and they're moving. Now I see it as being doing that. It's all being doing that. But for humans, there's that process. And I think it's the same with spiritual practices. As soon as you can get these things out of the mind and into the body, in this case with spiritual practices, that the emotion, the heart becomes very important. Things become emotional. And the emotions, according to the Gurdjieff system, the emotional center is actually the fastest of all the centers. It's faster than the moving instinctive. So you can have prescience. You can know what's going to happen before it happens through the emotional center. So when spiritual practices get into the emotional center, then self-inquiry falls away as a practice at that point, as a mental practice. And then very quickly the seeing becomes non-verbal and non-conceptual. And so the emotional center, in a way, the fourth way breaks everything up into pieces, and it's really all one. But the emotional center for a human is if you were going to break it up, I would say it's the closest to pure awareness, to being, that the human body has as a body, but it's still conditioned. But once everything gets to that place, then it all just spontaneously happens. The emotional center is very explosive. So you can have these credible awakenings that way. But all of the other parts of the body are all involved too. It's just that it's what's become dominant. So Kundalini experiences, that to me is the instinctive body, the inner body becoming dominant and awakening that way. So the awakenings can happen through any of these centers, but it seems to be very decisive when it's coming through the emotional center. All of the doubts are burned away in that moment, and it lets go. It's the final vestiges of the spiritual ego in the emotional center, and it's able to let go and die. And that's its purpose, I would say.
So it sounds like with the practice of self-inquiry that it's probably best if I don't try to do it while I'm in the midst of learning how to drive a car for the first time.
Right.
It's just kind of a common sense spiritual
you're
knowledge.
Gonna crash. And I think, I think everybody knows that somehow innately, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's the intelligence of being. Because remember, being is behind all of this. And being is God, you could say. Or it's unconditioned existence. Or it's any of those superlatives. And that's what's doing everything in the end. It seems like it's playing some kind of game, hide and seek or something, but in a very sophisticated, unimaginable way. And in itself, it's unspeakable. That's kind of why I touched on in the subtitles that what I'm really pointing to can't be spoken. So we can talk about infinite awareness and all of these superlatives, and they kind of give us a flavor, but the actual thing itself, thing in quotes, is not speakable by the human mind. It actually, the mind or the body mind, the organism can catch a glimpse. And that's all it can get, is a glimpse. But being itself is eternal. Like when the body mind does die in that awakening, it's so clear. But it's clear to who? It's kind of like a paradox. It's like being is knowing itself in a way that's unobscured by anything. And somehow that happens. If it hadn't been written down, it would still be a mystery. Like, I think, like, the fact that the Buddha and all of these sages over the millennia have pointed to the same thing, or no thing. It's like a scientific experiment. Everybody's getting the same results, so they can have confidence in that result. And this awakening thing is a little bit like that. So many people over the millennia in different parts of the world have all pointed to the same thing. And then if you see that for yourself, somehow all uncertainty dies in that moment. It's not because you read it somewhere, it's because it's seen, it's so self-evident. And then you go back and you read these doctrines and these teachings and you say, oh yeah, the mind can then accept. The mind can accept it. Because I think for me those first coming back from whatever happened there, the mind just didn't have a clue what was going on. It was just really confused, and yet there was this peace and certainty there. So the mind just kind of accepted. And then it went reading and looking, and it kind of saw things that it could satisfy that something actually happened here. I don't really understand it, but something did happen, and this peace is the outpouring of whatever happened there. And that's all I can say as a human to somebody else. They have to go there for themselves. And they won't be able to speak about it when they come back either. But they'll be able to point and hint and try and use analogies. And somehow we've been given that gift, all of us, to be able to tell a story that resonates with someone else, and they suddenly have an understanding. It's a beautiful thing that we share as humans. That ability.
Well, let me check my questions here. I feel like we've dived very deeply, very fast, and what more could be said?
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple of questions I like to ask most of my guests. Mm-hmm. As you know, I enjoy films. Are there any films that you feel can maybe capture some of the essence of the spiritual surge or awakening?
Yes, there is. One film comes to mind immediately. It's called Contact. It's with Jodie Foster, and it's based on a Carl Sagan book.
Tell me more.
Yeah, she's always interested in finding life out there and amongst the stars, even as a child. And she grows up to become a scientist, working for SETI. It's based on a real person, I think. Working for SETI, looking for some sign of life, and eventually they get a signal, and they decode it, and it's a map. It's a schema for building some kind of a machine that will take them to where the signal's coming from. So they build it. They build two, actually, because one of them gets destroyed. And the person that's supposed to go on the one that gets destroyed, he gets killed. So she's the only other person qualified. They didn't want her to go, even though she was the most qualified. Anyway, she gets to go on the second one that's built in Japan. And she goes. And so the machine is kind of like this gyroscope kind of device with a pod. So the gyroscope starts spinning, and it gets faster and faster, and it creates this kind of energy. And then the pod just drops through. So everyone looking from the outside sees a pod drop through and get caught in a net underneath the machine. And that's it. Like 2 seconds. For her, she goes on a journey that lasts several hours. And she travels through these wormholes and comes to this world where these beings are that contacted her. And the beings come to her. The being comes to her in the form of her father. And it does that so that she's not afraid, she's not scared. And so at first she thinks it's her father, and she hugs him, and he starts to talk to her, and she figures out that that's not her father, that's the being. And she says that to him, and he says, "That's my scientist." There's something that the father used to say to her all the time. When she figured something out, he would say, "That's my scientist."
Wow.
So the being has seen everything somehow, and so he says that, and then he tells her 1 or 2 things, and perhaps, at some later point more will be known. We might send some more information. And by the way, we're not the first. We're one of thousands. This has been going on for eons. We're just the ones now sending it to you. And then so she comes back. She has a recorder on a helmet. So she thinks she's captured everything. So when she comes back, she's so surprised to see everybody looking at her as if to say, "Well, that didn't work." She goes, "What do you mean? Well, you just dropped through the machine, and now you're getting out." So no one actually believes her. She tries to tell the story, no one believes her. And then later, the government get a hold of the recording. And the recording is 8 hours of static, but it's 8 hours. So they know that she's probably telling the truth. And then the story ends that way. But the way that I relate it to the spiritual search is that all of this effort is made for years, this whole journey, searching for something. And then the answer comes in a split second, and you can't tell anyone about it. So that's kind of how I feel.
Yeah.
You can only point and say you are, but you can't actually describe the experience. And no one would probably believe you anyway, even if you did. Yeah. It's a really beautiful film.
And how about books? If you knew that you were going to get sent to a desert island for the rest of your life, what's 2 books?
2 books? Yeah. Gosh. And that's a more difficult one. There's so many books.
Exactly.
What's the hardest one to follow that when you do get it, I like Huang Po. So what's that Zen book? The Zen Teachings of Huang Po.
Yeah.
It's a very thin little book, but you can read it over and over. It's a great book. And what else do I like? I do like the Nisargadatta Maharaj book, where he's just, I can't remember the title now, but he's just talking from his perspective, and how free he is in what he's able to say. He obviously went very deeply into his experience and saw this freedom, and was just able to kind of say that in his manner, because he wasn't the nicest person to be around. He would yell at you, and he was smoking cigarettes all the time. But he said the most beautiful things, So I would say, I can't remember the name of the book. Maybe it's I Am That.
That's his most famous book, I Am That.
It might be that. It might be one of the others. But yeah, those two I like a lot.
Okay. And in regards to your book, Imaginary Conversations with Imaginary People, I was curious if there are some dialogues, question and answer in your book, and some excerpts from, they look like online, maybe forums that you were commenting on.
Yeah.
Are all of those actual conversations, or did you sort of fictionalize some of those?
No, they're all actual conversations.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah. At a certain point, the conversations were so interesting, and they were like this interview. They drew out all kinds of things from me, and so I just thought I would start with those, and just see where it goes. And there was enough of them to make a book out of it. And then the questions and answers, those are all questions I've been asked over the years. Even while working in the fourth way, there are some things about the fourth way that are useful even after this, in terms of understanding the body and how it's built. I think there's a lot of very good information about the four centers, for instance. And there are finer and finer divisions of this. So for a psychologist, it's a goldmine. I don't know why more psychologists don't read Uspensky, because he really understood a lot about the human organism. So yeah, everything is verbatim, and I tried to be respectful of the other parts of the conversation. I paraphrased them because I didn't want to name anybody. I didn't want to impose on their privacy in that way. So I answered either directly using the whatever response came up, or I paraphrased to set the background to what I was going to say, and seemed to come out quite well. Quite happy with it.
Yeah, I definitely recommend the book. Available on Amazon, right?
Amazon and Barnes and Noble as a hardback.
Oh, the hardback as well. I love hardbacks.
Yeah, the hardback look. I have to say this, I'm not bragging, but I surprised myself with how good that looks.
I'm glad you brought that up. I did want to mention some of the illustrations in the book are really evocative. Perhaps is the right word. I know I had pitched you the idea of perhaps making a T-shirt off of some of these.
Yeah, I'm open to that.
Really good.
Yeah, I'm open to that. Whatever you want to do with that.
Yeah.
I have all these as PNGs, high res. Yeah, they're inspired by the brush and ink pen work of the China and Japan. I just love how I used to watch Thich Nhat Hanh, and he would do this painting, and it would just one brush stroke and spontaneous, and it would look beautiful. And I thought, I really like that. So I got inspired to try these. I did these with an AI, and then I tweaked them.
It's good work.
Yeah.
All right. Get the book. I recommend it. If people want to find out more about what you're doing, what you're up to, do you have a website?
Yes. I'm on Facebook. Just search for Filo Sophie King. But there's also a website that I'm doing with James Waite, who's another non-duality speaker. I've known him a long time. And that's called Non-Duality Living Cafe. And that is on YouTube. It's a YouTube channel. It's a website. And it's also on Facebook. So you can find me on either of those channels. Those are probably the best ways to reach me. Other than if you do buy the book, I did put an email address in there.
That's right. We're not going to reveal it, though.
No.
You got to buy the book to get the lifetime spiritual support.
Yeah, I know. I mean that. So if you do buy the book and you do want that, please send me an email and we can strike up a conversation.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
It's been very enjoyable.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. I mean, we could talk more, but we got to get back to goat painting.
Right? Got those nuggets to find.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Journals of Spiritual Discovery. I'm your host, Sean Nevins. For more information about today's guest, as well as more interviews, books, and other resources, go to spiritualteachers.org. That's spiritualteachers.org.